Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scrap Mechanic. I recently watched a video by Reed Captain where he built a shotgun in the game. I was pretty impressed, and it reminded me of how in the past I've tried to 3D model a working revolver design. But after thinking about it, I realized that I could probably do that pretty well in Scrap Mechanic. So today, I'll be trying to create a revolver with a firing rod mechanism that implements a real trigger and hammer. After loading into the world, I immediately found a good place to build over here by the water. I started by trying to make a bullet design, something that was self-contained and had enough firepower to propel itself. I experimented with blocks that could and couldn't explode, which is seemingly inconsistent by the way. Metal 2 only explodes if the explosive is attached directly to it, while Metal 3 never explodes. I tried to surround big and little explosives with Metal 3 so that they could be loaded into a mechanism and propel an attached bullet. This didn't really work because explosives didn't give much velocity to directly attach pieces, and removing the leftover casing proved quite difficult. So after trying for about 20 minutes to design a self-contained bullet, I moved on to trying to get the explosives to just propel anything at all. I realized that Metal 3 is the only block that consistently doesn't explode, but it's also quite heavy. This means that any bullet I build would either have to be made of Metal 3 or surrounded by it, either way increasing the weight pretty significantly. Because of this, I tried a number of things to make it work. I protected wood so I could shoot that, I tried making an object designed to partially explode, I separated the explosives from the bullet, I tried adding many explosives, I used big and little explosives, I even made a rig to test different designs faster. After an additional 10 minutes, I decided that I would just come back to this. My goal here was to design the mechanism, not necessarily to design the bullet itself. Spoiler, I did not come back to this. Now I moved on to the start of the pin mechanism itself. If you haven't seen how a mechanism like this works before, here's an animation by the Soul Train on YouTube. You can see how the hammer comes forward to strike the primer on the rear of the chambered bullet. The primer explodes the gunpowder within, and that's what propels the bullet forward. Now, despite what you just saw and what I just explained, that isn't actually what I'm doing here exactly. I'm going for somewhat of a cross between that and a modern handgun, as instead of the hammer striking the bullet, a separate pin is put under pressure and then releases to strike it. Yes, I did just make this a more complicated version of a handgun, except with a revolving chamber. Kind of. Anyway, moving on. In order to put tension on the pin, I started by trying to use a piece of compressed suspension. The idea was that when compressed by a rotating arm, the arm would continue past the suspension and it would release all of its energy into an explosive. This build took a ton of tweaking, not dissimilar from the clock build I did a few weeks ago. I was trying to get the rotating arm to compress the suspension, but then after that still slip past it so it could spring forward. I tried some piston stuff to get it to work in both directions, as well as use my favorite block, the screw, to fine-tune it to be just right. However, similar to the clock yet again, even after I got this working, I realized it wasn't quite what I wanted. It turns out that the suspension doesn't really have enough strength to set off an explosive consistently, and if I up its power, the rotating arm can't compress it. After doing some thinking, I remembered that pistons have some play to them, making them just stronger suspension in a way. The difficult thing about pistons, however, is that they are very glitchy. Their strength is actually tied to their speed, so if you want more powerful punch, it has to move faster. This would be fine, except that pistons plus speed plus scrap mechanic is just a recipe for explosive physics, and not in a good way. Oh god. No, don't bring it back with you. The piston did have plenty of strength though, fortunately, and was able to detonate the explosive consistently and every time in my testing. Now that I had that working, I started thinking about how I would implement an actual hammer and trigger into this design, and that's where this design specifically started to fall apart. I needed some way to pull the piston back, hold it until the trigger was pulled, and then reset everything. I ended up with some weird Rube Goldberg machine to prevent stuff from moving and then move it when I wanted to. This turned into a mess though, where I had 2 pistons, 3 bearings, and a few switches, all interacting in a way physics did not like. I learned from this though that a bearing with an arm can act like a very soft spring in some cases, and though I didn't end up using it here, I will keep that in mind. After realizing the idea was sound but I had no clue how to implement it, I went ahead and moved on to designing the final mechanism, to get some idea of how things would be placed. It was worth noting that I started designing this part about an hour into my recording, and it was a 4-hour recording total. I started by making what would eventually become the chamber. I knew that no matter what the inside looked like, this needed to be a very specific shape in order to fit a large explosive, and I used that as my scale for the rest of the design. I built a skeleton frame based on Revolver references, including building the trigger and hammer in place so I knew where they would be. And then I had all the intractable parts down, now I just need to make them interact correctly, which is the hard part. The first thing I did was build a pin on the end of a piston. At the end of the day, the pin needed to be there and the piston was the only thing strong enough, so that was a good place to start. I spent a long time trying to get the hammer to just directly connect to the firing pin. I was having issues with this because you can only weld to a piston when the creation is on a lift. This didn't work because the piston starts in an unextended position, so the pin is back, while I built the hammer in its extended position, so the pin would be forward. Effectively, pistons start bottomed out and there's no way to change that. While the obvious solution is just to build the hammer in its back position instead of its forward position, I insisted on being difficult. First, I tried connecting the pin to the hammer directly, which obviously didn't work. I then tried connecting a piston on the linkage so that I could make the linkage longer after it spawns in, but if I've learned anything from this, it's that more pistons equals more issues, so they just kept fighting each other. I then tried another direct linkage, which didn't work again. Clearly I hadn't realized at this point what the issue actually was. And then another one. Does that do anything different at all? No, it doesn't work at all. I moved on to trying a linkage that would only connect after it spawned in using a hook around a pin. I tried a number of variations on this idea, but it didn't work because the physics just aren't nearly consistent enough and the loose joint just kept spinning around and phasing through itself. I thought that maybe the piston was just too strong for the loose bearings, so I swapped it out for a suspension piece. I'd already proven in the past that a suspension wasn't strong enough to trigger the explosive, but I just wanted to get something to work. I also thought that because suspension starts extended while the piston starts retracted, that it would mesh better with my existing design. I realized that with the new linkage and suspension, the bearing the hammer was rotating on was no longer powerful enough to pull the hammer back alone. To remediate this, I tried to add an external piston that would push and or pull the hammer physically, but yet again encountered more pistons equals more issues. To recap, the order of operations is the hammer gets pulled back, which pulls the firing pin back. This needs to lock in this position and then unlock rapidly when the trigger is pulled. At this point, I started working on the trigger pulling part of that. My original idea was to lock the hammer itself to the trigger in a kind of ratcheting mechanism. This didn't work because, well, ratcheting mechanisms inherently don't go backward, which is something I need in order to reset the gun. That, and I had no idea how to even create one in my limited form factor. I then tried some stuff with suspension to get it to slide in one direction and not the other, but this didn't work because the suspension either compressed in both directions or in neither direction. You can see here I tried a number of different ways to get this to work, including using screws. I went back and forth from suspension, pipes, blocks, pistons, and even more pipes. I'm skipping a lot here because I put a ton of time and tweaking into a section that I ended up completely redoing. You can see the basic functionality of what I'm going for here though. A pin here. It stops it, and then when the pin goes away, it springs forward. After basically scrapping everything I had there, I went back to a piston-based firing mechanism, because as suspected, the suspension wasn't strong enough to detonate the explosive. At some point, I even had a piston plus suspension pin. The idea was that suspension starts out expanded, but pistons start out contracted, which would give me more room to attach the hammer. Not only was that not smart, but it was also extremely glitchy. You can see it bends at the suspension here. Again, skipping a lot of boring tinkering, I realized that the best way to lock the firing pin would be with a piece of perpendicular suspension. This did cause a pretty bad suspension glitch, which is when pushing a piece of suspension on a creation causes it to rotate, but you can see the pin can slide smoothly back but gets locked in the back position. I really tried to avoid the suspension glitch, but the lock worked so much better with suspension, and I figured that the creation would end up being too heavy to notice anyway, so I went ahead and moved on. I went ahead and connected the trigger so that all it does is release the lock. This makes the pin spring forward with enough force to detonate the explosive. After that, all that was left to make was the hammer actually pull back the pin. I put in a ton of work to try to get the hammer to actuate correctly as I had built it, including pistons to push it around after spawning, but in the end I realized that I can just build it in the back position and save myself so much work, making it more consistent in the process. If I could just find the way to build this at the angle it will already be at. So just build it that way. I did have to use a switch to prime the gun's hammer, but that's just because the player's sledgehammer isn't strong enough to pull it back. If you wanted to, you could actually build another creation to pull back the hammer, so it is physically interacting. This was just the easiest way to do it. Finally, all of the internals were done. Using some references, I built up the exterior to look vaguely revolver-y, which I think turned out pretty well, and I gave it another test. I put 3 explosives in a tube and called that a chamber, and I was going to put on 6 chambers, but it was really difficult to build 6 equally spaced lines on this scale, so I settled for this 4-chambered barrel-less monstrosity and gave it a final test. And remove that, and the one over here. Pull it back. Ooh, that should actually be a button too, but oh well. And then get on your lift. And hit the trigger. I did not hit that nearly hard enough. And hit the trigger. Hit the trigger. Yeah. And there it is, in all its glory-ish. I built a mechanically fired handgun revolver thingy in Scrap Mechanic. It wasn't that hard to make, but it was really hard to do on the scale and with the tools provided by the game. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. This is the second video like this I've made, so if you're interested in another one, go check out the video on the cards of a clock I built in Scrap Mechanic that I mentioned earlier. Anyway, thanks for watching, and goodbye.